Hey there, my name's Jerry Shannon. I'm a faculty member at the University of Georgia. I'm going to offer a short talk today. This is for AAG 22 around urban renewal and college campuses, particularly something called Section 112, which is part of the urban renewal program, and its role in a specific project at the University of Georgia called Project R50 that destroyed a black neighborhood called Lindentown here close to campus. I'm going to talk through those two things, the context, the project, and then talk a little bit about the ways I think that history matters currently in our discussions of the public mission of the university. So let me go ahead and start slides. So let's do some background here. What was Section 112? Section 112 was a particular amendment to the Housing Act that was passed in 1959 that incentivized cooperation between universities and their nearby cities. There's basically financial incentive for the two of them to work together. You can see the language here around Section 112 was that this program could promote the public welfare and proper development of the community by fostering cohesive neighborhood environment compatible with the functions and needs of such an educational institution. Like many urban renewal programs, it took this attitude around battling slum and blight, slum communities and blight to modernize cities and make them more livable for everyone involved, even if that involved a lot of short-term dislocation for many of the most marginal residents of these communities. So it was originally sponsored by presidents of several universities, UPenn, Chicago, and NYU. Those universities had actually carried out their own urban renewal projects, I think, in many cases. Prior to this, so Section 112 was meant to further continued advancement. This is some of the language that, if you look at some of the congressional hearings at the time, used. Last month, the executive director of the Southeast Section, an effective slum battling agency that owes its origins and continued to the University of Chicago, looked out his window at the university's Gothic spires and told a visitor, "It would have been easier for those men to have stayed in their ivory tower, but they chose the other way. The university elected to give leadership to the end that American cities may not become the symbol of failure, but be evidence of the success of American democracy." University leaders who are willing to help to the rebuild of the communities in which their universities sit. And that was, I think, fairly typical kind of language. A report at the time says 120 colleges and 75 hospitals. Section 112 benefited both those institutions, were approved. In terms of where those were at, this is not a complete list. This is from University of Richmond's database. But you can see some of the geographic distribution here, showing both the funding, and their total funding was about 117 million, and the number of households that were displaced, which is also a part of federal records as well. The project we're going to talk about as a case study for this today is the one at University of Georgia, which is actually a fairly modest one as these things go. And I want you to keep that in mind as we talk about this, that this is the modest version of these projects, that in many cases they were much larger scale than what we're talking about here. So as I said, that was Project R50 at the University of Georgia. Displaced 65 households according to federal records and took in just under $1 million in federal funding. The blue line here is the outline of that project. This is the main part of campus, the football stadium here. And in particular, we're going to talk about this neighborhood that was seated here called Lindentown. That was a black neighborhood. This area was predominantly white. This area was predominantly black, or was all black. It's shown here. This is the one picture we have of the whole neighborhood. So you're kind of standing here looking north, and this is what the neighborhood looked like. Right? This is something called Drool Academy. It was a black school that we'll talk about a little bit later on. So in language around this urban renewal project, you can see the same language, the same kinds of tropes around both battling slum clearance and advancing the public mission of the university. So in a statement from the university president, O.C. Adderhold, we talk about how the University of Georgia has a broad obligations to every individual in Georgia, and how this project contributed to the development of the individual, but also the contribution of the individual to the whole of society, right? And how this was going to ultimately benefit everyone. At the same time, President Adderhold, writing to Richard B. Russell, who was an influential senator at the time, asking for support for urban renewal funding, what Adderhold wrote was, this project is extremely important in terms of the growth and development of the University of Georgia. The area involved is west of Lumpkin Street and would clear out the total slum area, which now exists off Baxter Street. So you have that same language around slum clearance that was common in urban renewal kinds of projects, right? And so over the course of a couple of years, we see this red area, which are the parcels owned by the University of Georgia in Lindentown specifically, this boundary here is the Lindentown neighborhood, that those homes were just taken. Now, for university officials, this was something where building on areas they already owned, like Area A that's listed here, was a tremendous financial advantage. But for residents, the story was very different. Miss Hattie Whitehead, who was a teenager at the time of this redevelopment, has written a book called Giving Voice to Lindentown. And she recalls it. One night she went into the kitchen and her mother was having a panic attack. She gasped for air as tears rolled down her cheeks. In between sobs, she said she was just overwhelmed with us having to move, not knowing where we were moving or how we would get there. There was nothing I or anyone else in the room could do to console her. Right? And so you have two very different perspectives on how this was proceeding. There's various kinds of techniques that were used to terrorize residents and convince them to move. So here we've got an inspection report where it talks about the burning of properties in order to speed up progress of putting in sewer lines. These, by the way, were sewer lines that were not installed when this was an African-American neighborhood. And so it only comes in as the university is taking control of the properties. And a lot of residents talk about walking by burned homes that used to house families that were close friends to them. Christine Johnson, another former resident, talks about getting up at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning and hearing bulldozers, and her mother having to calm her down because she was so scared that the bulldozers were going to come for her house or come there even while they were still sleeping. And so there was these kinds of terroristic kinds of techniques that were used, and that's the term that residents talk about. In the end, Lindentown was fully taken by the university. It's now a parking deck, the West Campus parking deck that is primarily occupied by students. These photos here show, this is Bobby Crook is one of our two residents. This is Miss Hattie. This was the home that Bobby lived in at the time. His parents were one of the last ones to move. And you can see actually the university housing already constructed. Bobby's home is right here. This is what that same spot looks like today. This is Bobby talking about his memories of the home in that same spot. Residents were relocated to primarily African-American neighborhoods, which undoubtedly affected kind of the appreciation that they and their families were able to receive for new properties they lived in. At the same time, we see lots of stories of resistance here. So one example here is this letter from, well, these two documents. One is within the Redevelopment Authority. We see here that there's a judgment of eminent domain judgment for $2,500 for a particular property. And here that's actually saying we thought we'd only have to pay $2,100, but $2,500 we can do that, basically, is what they're saying. The owners, and in this case it was an heir property, so it's a bunch of descendants, sued and said we want an appeal here. And then went to a jury trial and they actually received $6,500. There were 3 properties that did receive higher amounts. Every person who appealed that decision won and received substantially higher amounts than what they did originally. You see notes of other kinds of resistance here. There's a document. This is a housing survey that was done in a lot of these places. Sometimes residents just refuse to answer those questions. Here, there's a note here of somebody saying, can't buy this house, going to stay right here, and this person doesn't believe the house can actually be taken. Geneva Johnson was another former resident. Her family actually moved her house to a nearby street, East Broad Street, and she still lives in that house today. So they preserved the structure even if they weren't able to hold on to the land. Right? And that activism goes on for today. That resistance goes on for today. A few years ago, this Lindentown project started up as a way to highlight what was largely forgotten history, at least for folks who weren't former residents of that neighborhood, of the Lindentown neighborhood, and to push for redress and reparations for the damage that was done through a process that underpaid and terrorized residents of that neighborhood. And so through pressure on the local county commission, there was a resolution passed by the county that officially apologized for the county's role and the city's role in promoting this project. There's been national press on this. The Washington Post and NBC have both published stories that have talked about Lindentown. It actually was talked about during the third quarter of a Georgia Bulldogs game by one of the color commentators this last season. And then for the university's perspective, though, that has not been the attack they've taken. This is one response that was written to Miss Hattie in the letter outlining their desires for some kinds of reparations. And it says, in the early 1960s, the city of Athens, using federal funding, exercised its powers of eminent domain to acquire multiple tracts of land, which were later sold to the University System of Georgia Board of Regents. Notably missing in that sentence is the University of Georgia. It's the city, it's the state governing body. UGA didn't have anything to do with it. right? And instead, what's highlighted in this letter, over the past year, many faculty, staff, and students on our campus have worked to develop a 5-year plan of action to enhance diversity and inclusion. And they're going to begin to implement the plan this fall. This is a plan for diversity and inclusion that's on the university's own terms. So on the one hand, denying any responsibility for what would happen on Lindentown, and on the other hand, saying we are doing what we think is right that doesn't involve conversation with residents of the Lindentown neighborhood, basically dismissing any claims they have for action by the university. So why does this matter? Well, I think many of you have probably seen this article that came out a couple of years ago in 2020 called Land Grab Universities, and it's primarily about the seizure of land through the Morrill Land Grant Act in the 1800s, and that's about indigenous land. It's about the seizure of indigenous land for the benefit of public universities, for particular public universities. And we've been thinking through, I think this article by Goldstein et al., thinking through what land grant missions mean for public universities and how the public is served and which public is served, and thinking about universities as tools of basically settler colonialism. And while we're not talking about indigenous land in the case of Lindentown, we are talking about existing residents whose claims to property were delegitimized systematically particularly through the language of slum clearance, and whose current claims are similarly not being paid attention to by the very folks that took that land. And so I'm going to close with this quote from David Hugel, from Settler Colonial City. To paraphrase Wolf's oft-repeated phrasing, settler colonization is not so much an event as an enduring element of the broader field of power relations that structure outcomes in settler societies. That is, it didn't just happen in the 1960s, right? This is ongoing. Accordingly, one of the core objectives of settler colonial scholarship is to understand how these power relations have been recalibrated, recomposed, and transformed in ways that have allowed them to continue to shape relationships even in the present. And that is to say, again, that Lindentown's story is not something that just happened in the past. I think it's important that we reckon with that past, that we understand the history, particularly of Section 112. That's not something that's been looked at in a systemic way, at least as much as I can tell, in promoting the expansion of universities and the university systems. But it's also that current activism, the current resistance to discussing those histories, is itself a part of that very same historical process. So I mentioned Drool Academy briefly before. It was a black school that was located in Lindentown, and many residents, former residents, talk about it really fondly as a place that they have lots of good memories for. It was closed in the mid-50s, ostensibly as part of desegregation, but is also part of this urban renewal effort. And there's actually a plaque for Drool Academy. But you wouldn't hardly know it if you walked through campus. As you can see, these hedges have basically overgrown it. And so one of the things that I think is important in this kind of scholarship, and one of the things we're trying to do with this project, is essentially to trim back these hedges, to make this history, which the university would prefer to just have be basically covered up, or that prefer we can move on to it, make it visible in a way that promotes or provokes current conversation, both for compensation and redress for folks for past wrongs, but also the university's current role in displacing folks through its own expansion, its current expansion, and through things like affordable housing issues or even land grabs that are happening at the current moment. And so I think that's really useful as a way to kind of think about that. Rochelle Berry is a doctoral student in our department. She's actually shown right here, and she's doing research on Lindentown. She talks about it as reclaiming the plantation, which I think gets at a similar kind of dynamic. So I'll stop there with this limited time. But hopefully this is a helpful way to at least introduce some research that we're doing on Lindentown and thinking about urban renewal and universities.